Welcome back. In the first of the mini lectures last time on the President and the Constitution, or the Presidency and the Constitution, I really talked about two different things last time. The first were the requirements to be president, which don't appear to be constitutionally imposing. You have to be at least 35 years of age, a natural born citizen, and a resident for 14 years. And then the second was tenure. And I talked about how this has been a significant change from what the founding fathers originally intended. Uh, the term limit for a president is still 4 years, the way that it was originally established in the Constitution. But remember, originally there were no term limits on the presidency. George Washington, remember, established an informal two-term tradition which was respected by presidents until Franklin Roosevelt came along and broke that two-term tradition 150 years later in 1940. Roosevelt went on to win 4 terms. He died early in his 4th term. And one of the reactions to Franklin Roosevelt was a constitutional change, the 22nd Amendment, which limits how long an individual can serve as president. I spilled some water, so that's why I'm cleaning it up before it gets on the computer here. Clumsy me. So that's what I covered last time. So what should you know? You should know the requirements to be president. You should know that a president serves a 4-year term of office, and you should know that the 22nd Amendment limits how long an individual can serve as president. If we go down that list that's in front of you, the third element of the presidency that is discussed in the Constitution is the impeachment process. And this is one of the more misunderstood elements, even though we have had an impeachment recently. Donald Trump became the third president in American history to be impeached. Like his two predecessors, Andrew, not Lyndon, Andrew Johnson, as well as Bill Clinton, none of the presidents have been removed from office. So a lot of people mistakenly believe that an impeachment means that a president is removed from office. And that is not what an impeachment is. The actual impeachment is an accusation. So if I were to ask you on the exam who impeaches the president, the answer would be the House of Representatives. So it is the House of Representatives that accuses or impeaches the president. An impeachment is for something that's quite vague. The Constitution says high crimes and misdemeanors and never really defines exactly what high crimes and misdemeanors is. Even though it sounds like a flippant answer, maybe the best answer that I've ever heard to what constitutes high crimes and misdemeanors was by Gerald Ford, who at one time was the minority leader of the House. Gerald Ford, of course, became vice president when Spiro Agnew resigned. Nixon selected him to be the new vice president. And of course, Gerald Ford became president when Nixon resigned. And when Gerald Ford was asked what high crimes and misdemeanors is, Gerald Ford's answer kind of startled people, I think, when he said, well, high crimes and misdemeanors is whatever a majority of the House of Representatives says it is. And I think that that's true. I've actually listened to a whole variety of academics discuss what high crimes and misdemeanors meant at the time of the Constitutional Convention. I was on a panel many years ago where these attorneys were describing legal standards, and when they asked me, I said, well, these men know a lot more about impeachment than I do. They certainly have a lot more training in what the law and what the legal standard for high crimes and misdemeanors is. But I would just point out that the House of Representatives decides what this is for themselves. And the way that I have it listed in the notes, right, is that it is the House of Representatives that has set its own standard for what this means. You will notice that there is a mistake in the notes in front of you. And so because this has happened recently and I was in a hurry to get these notes out to you, I made a mistake. So you need to correct it if I were to ask this question on the exam, right? Your note says that there have been two presidents that have been impeached by the House, Andrew Johnson and Bill Clinton. Well, that was true as of the last time I taught this course, but that has changed. We have now had a third president that has been impeached by the House of Representatives, and of course, that is Donald Trump. So please make sure you correct that error that's in your notes. It is not two presidents that have been impeached by the House. It is three presidents that have been impeached by the House. So in all three of these cases, once the House of Representatives has engaged in the impeachment and voted to impeach a president, there then is a Senate trial. The trial is presided over by the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And the Senate then votes whether or not basically to convict the president. If the House of Representatives accuses or impeaches the president, it is the Senate that serves as a jury. And if you get 2/3 of the Senate voting to remove, then the president would be removed from office. No president has been formally removed from office by the Senate. Andrew Johnson survived that Senate trial by one solitary vote. Bill Clinton survived this easily. There was not even a majority of the Senate that voted to remove. And President Trump survived this by a wide margin as well. A lot of people think, well, what about Richard Nixon? Wasn't Nixon impeached? And the answer is no, he wasn't impeached. The House of Representatives drew up 5 articles of impeachment against Richard Nixon. They held hearings. They listened to testimony. The House Judiciary Committee then voted on whether to advance those 5 charges, those 5 accusations to the full House. The Judiciary Committee voted to forward 3 of the charges to the House of Representatives. The House Judiciary Committee believed that the other 2 charges were much weaker, the evidence was weaker, and so they voted against forwarding those 2 charges. Before the full House of Representatives could vote on those 3 articles of impeachment, a couple of senators led by Barry Goldwater and Robert Dole went to the White House. They talked to Mr. Nixon and they said, Mr. President, the Senate does not want to vote to remove you from office. The House of Representatives doesn't want to vote to send us those charges. But we believe the House is prepared to vote and vote overwhelmingly to forward those charges to the Senate, and we in the Senate are prepared to vote to remove you from office. Now, this was quite a revelation for Mr. Nixon because Barry Goldwater was one of Richard Nixon's best friends. And Goldwater told Nixon, you know, I don't want to do this, but I'm prepared to vote you out tonight. And when Nixon asked Goldwater, well, if the vote were tonight in the Senate, how many senators are still loyal to me? How many votes do you think I could count on? Senator Goldwater said about a dozen. But they haven't heard all the evidence yet, and things are going to get a lot worse for you. So would Mr. Nixon have been impeached by the House? Without any question. Would the Senate have voted to remove Mr. Nixon? Without any question, and by a wide margin. Both Democrats and Republicans were prepared to remove him. So Mr. Nixon resigned before there was an impeachment vote in the House, and obviously before it went to the Senate. So what do you need to know about the impeachment process? Know that the House of Representatives impeaches the president. know that 3 presidents have been impeached, know that no president has been formally removed from office by the Senate, but 1 president was informally removed. And by that, what I mean is Mr. Nixon understood that if I don't resign, I would be removed. The fourth element is a constitutional change. Now, for many years, we had kind of what was informally known as the curse of the zero. So every president elected in a year ending in 0 from 1840 to 1960 died in office. William Henry Harrison was elected in 1840, and he gave the longest inauguration speech on the coldest inauguration day in American history without wearing a top coat. He caught pneumonia and died a month later. In 1860, Abraham Lincoln was elected and he was assassinated. Garfield was elected in 1880, he was assassinated. In 1900, McKinley was assassinated. In 1920, Harding was elected and he died either of natural causes, a heart attack, or I've even heard rumors that perhaps he was poisoned to death, possibly with his wife being involved. The point is, several presidents have died in office, and at one time, vice presidents then became the new president, but there was no mechanism to replace the vice president. And so we went without a vice president until the next election. So, for example, when Franklin Roosevelt died in 1945, Harry Truman took over. And Harry Truman was the president, and there was no vice president until the election of 1948, when Truman was elected president. In 1960, President Kennedy was elected, and of course in 1963, President Kennedy was assassinated. Lyndon Johnson became the new president, and there was no vice president until Johnson was elected in 1964, and Hubert Humphrey became his vice president. After the assassination of President Kennedy, people in Congress got together and said, you know, we've kind of been living dangerously here. We've had presidents die in office, we've had vice presidents die in office, and there should be a mechanism by which, if a president or a vice president dies, then there should be a mechanism to replace that vice presidential vacancy. Now, what's intriguing, and I did a little research on this when I was a graduate student, one of the things that I found interesting in researching this topic was that all of the discussion that revolved around the 25th Amendment revolved around the notion of a presidential death or a vice presidential death. And of course, there's an old saying, right, that if you plan for something, then something that you never even saw coming is probably what's going to be the result. And certainly that's the case with the 25th Amendment. The 25th Amendment, in terms of vice presidential vacancy, I don't know why my nose is itching so much, but it is. Superstition is it means you're going to come into a lot of money. So who knows, maybe I'll win the lottery this semester, we'll see. But the idea was that that only death would invoke this 25th Amendment. Now, historically, the 25th Amendment for vice presidential vacancy has been invoked on 2 occasions. And on both occasions, the reason that the 25th Amendment was invoked had nothing to do with death whatsoever. It had to do with scandal. So we have a vice president, Mr. Agnew, that resigns. We need a new vice president. We get Vice President Ford. Mr. Nixon resigns. We get President Ford, and he, of course, nominates a new vice president, Vice President Rockefeller. In the next mini lecture, I'll talk very, very briefly about the 25th Amendment, give you some clues, but I want to focus my attention on the Electoral College, which I think is the most intriguing aspect of the Constitution and the presidency.